The first time I heard the screaming, I was 3 hours into a 12-hour shift at St. Mary's General Hospital. My name is Dr. Marcus Chen, and I've been practicing emergency medicine for 8 years, long enough to know that hospitals never truly sleep, but also long enough to recognize when something isn't right. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October when the sound first pierced through the antiseptic silence of the fourth-floor corridor, a raw, agonized shriek that seemed to claw its way through the walls themselves. I dropped my clipboard, the metal clattering against the linoleum as my body reacted before my mind could process what I'd heard. The sound had come from operating. Room 7.0R7 had been closed for renovation for the past 3 weeks. I knew this because I'd helped transport Mrs. Patterson there for her emergency appendectomy just hours before they'd sealed it off. The contractors had found asbestos in the ceiling tiles, and hospital administration had immediately cordoned off the entire room. Yellow caution tape still stretched across the entrance, and I'd seen the facilities manager personally check the locks twice during my shift, but someone, or something, was screaming inside. I ran down the corridor, my sneakers squeaking against the freshly waxed floor. The screaming continued, rising and falling in waves of pure terror. It was a sound I'd heard before in the ER, the kind of primal agony that comes from unimaginable pain. But this was different. This carried something else within it. Something that made my skin crawl and my hands shake as I reached for the door handle. The handle turned, it shouldn't have. The room was supposed to be locked, sealed, empty. But the metal gave way under my grip, and the door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo the horror of what I was hearing. The screaming stopped. OR7 was dark, illuminated only by the dim emergency lighting that cast long shadows across the covered equipment. Plastic sheeting draped everything like burial shrouds, and the smell of construction dust mixed with something else, something sweet and metallic that I recognized all too well. Blood. "Hello?" I called out, reaching for the light switch. "Is someone in here? This is Dr. Chen." Silence. The fluorescent lights flickered to life, revealing the room in stark detail. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Equipment covered, floor partially torn up for the renovation, ceiling tiles missing to reveal the skeletal framework above. But the metallic smell was stronger now, and as I stepped further into the room I saw it. Dark stains on the floor that the construction crew had somehow missed. Stains that looked fresh despite the room being sealed for weeks. My medical training kicked in, overriding the primal fear that was clawing at my chest. I knelt beside the largest stain, pulling a pen light from my coat pocket. The light revealed what I already suspected: blood, and lots of it. But that was impossible. No one had been in this room since Mrs. Patterson's surgery, and she'd walked out of here with nothing more than a small incision. A sound from behind me made me spin around. Not screaming this time, but something worse, a wet, sliding noise like something being dragged across the floor. The room was empty. I backed toward the door, every instinct telling me to run, but my eyes caught something that made me freeze. On the surgical table, barely visible beneath the plastic covering, was a shape. A human-shaped form that definitely hadn't been there moments before. The plastic moved, up and down, rhythmically, as if whatever was underneath was breathing. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, grabbing my phone to call security. But there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. The breathing under the plastic became more labored, more desperate, and then the screaming started again. Muffled now, but coming, directly from the table. Someone was under there, trapped, suffocating, and I was the only one who could help them. I approached the table slowly, every fiber of my being screaming at me to run. But I was a doctor. I'd taken an oath. First, do no harm, but that also meant not standing by while someone suffered. I grabbed the edge of the plastic sheeting and pulled it back. Nothing. The table was empty, its steel surface gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. But the screaming continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. That's when I noticed the surgery schedule still hanging on the wall, the last schedule before the room was closed. Mrs. Patterson's appendectomy was listed at 11:30 p.m. But there was another entry below it written in different handwriting. Emergency surgery, 2:45 a.m., patient unknown. 2:45 a.m. That was less than 10 minutes ago. My hands shook as I read the entry again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The handwriting looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. The screaming had stopped again, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I needed to get out of that room. I needed to call security, report what I'd found, and let someone else figure out what was happening. But as I turned toward the door, I saw her. Mrs. Patterson was standing in the corner of the room, still wearing her hospital gown from 3 weeks ago. Her gray hair hung limp around her shoulders, and her skin had taken on a waxy pallor that I'd seen too many times in the morgue. But her eyes were alert, focused, and filled with an accusation that made my blood run cold. "You left me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible over the thundering of my heart. "You all left me." "Mrs. Patterson?" I managed to choke out. "But you recovered. You went home. I saw you leave." She shook her head slowly, and as she did, I noticed the surgical gown beginning to change color. Dark stains spread across the fabric, concentrating around her abdomen where we'd made the incision. "I never left," she said. "None of us have left." "Us?" The room suddenly felt crowded. Shapes began to materialize from the shadows. Patients I recognized from over the years. Mr. Rodriguez, who died during what should have been routine heart surgery. Sarah Kim, the college student who'd come in after a car accident and never woken up from the anesthesia. David Thompson, the construction worker who'd bled out on this very table when we couldn't stop the internal bleeding. They were all there, standing around the room like a grotesque surgical team, and they were all looking at me with the same accusatory stare. "We trusted you," Sarah said, her voice carrying the hollow echo of someone speaking from the bottom of a well. "We put our lives in your hands." "And you failed us," Mr. Rodriguez added, dark fluid beginning to leak from the corner of his mouth. "One by one, you failed us all." I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to explain that medicine isn't perfect and that we can't save everyone. But the words wouldn't come. Because looking at their faces, I began to remember things I'd tried to forget. Small mistakes, corners cut, decisions made in exhaustion that might have contributed to their deaths. Mrs. Patterson stepped closer, and I could see now that her abdomen wasn't just stained, it was torn open, revealing the surgical site that had never properly healed. "The screaming you heard," she said, "it was us, all of us. We've been screaming for years, Dr. Chen, but no one listens. No one remembers. You move on to the next patient, the next surgery, the next mistake, and we're forgotten." "I didn't forget," I said weakly. "I remember all of you. I carry you with me." "Do you?" David Thompson's voice was wet, gurgling, as if he was still drowning in his own blood. "Then why did you sign my death certificate without mentioning that you'd nicked my hepatic artery during the procedure? Why did you let my family think it was just one of those things that happens?" The room began to spin. I gripped the edge of the surgical table, trying to steady myself, but my hand came away sticky with fresh blood. "And Mrs. Patterson," Sarah continued, "why didn't you tell her family that you'd left a surgical sponge inside her abdomen? That she didn't die from post-operative complications, she died from your negligence?" "That's not... I didn't..." But the words died in my throat because I remembered now. The missing sponge count, the X-ray that showed a foreign object, the decision to discharge her anyway, thinking it was just a shadow on the film. The screaming started again, but this time I realized it wasn't coming from the ghosts surrounding me. It was coming from me. I ran, pushed past the accusatory figures and bolted for the door, my feet slipping on the blood that now seemed to cover every surface of the room. I could hear them following me, their voices joining together in a chorus of condemnation that echoed through the corridors as I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the elevator, slamming my hand against the call button repeatedly until the doors opened. As they closed behind me, I caught one last glimpse of OR7. Mrs. Patterson was standing in the doorway, no longer accusatory but sad, infinitely sad. We just want you to remember, she called out as the elevator descended. We just want someone to remember that we were here. The elevator doors closed and I was alone with my reflection in the polished steel. My face was pale, my hands shaking, my hospital coat stained with blood that I couldn't explain. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I walked straight to the security desk and reported what I'd found. Gas leak in OR7, I told them. Possible hallucinations from chemical exposure. They needed to check the room immediately and keep everyone out until hazmat could clear it. The security guard, a heavy-set man named Pete who'd worked the night shift for longer than I'd been at the hospital, gave me a concerned look. You okay, Doc? You look like you've seen a ghost. I almost laughed at that. Something like that. Just make sure no one goes into that room tonight. Doc, Pete said, looking confused. OR7's been completely gutted for the past 3 weeks. There's nothing in there but exposed framework and construction debris. Are you sure you were in the right room? I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. The surgical table, the equipment, all moved out when they started the renovation. Room's been empty since they found the asbestos. I excused myself and walked to the nearest bathroom, locking the door behind me. In the mirror, I could see that my hands were clean, no blood. My coat was pristine white, showing no signs of the stains I'd seen in the elevator, but I could still smell it, that sweet metallic scent that clung to the inside of my nostrils. And I could still hear them faintly, like voices carried on a distant wind. The patients I'd lost, the ones I'd failed, the ones I'd tried to forget. I pulled out my phone and did something I hadn't done in years. I looked up Mrs. Patterson's obituary. Eleanor Patterson, age 67, died October 15th due to post-operative complications following routine surgery at St. Mary's General Hospital. She is survived by October 15th. That was today. 3 weeks to the day after her surgery. The surgery where I'd lost count of the sponges, where I'd been tired, careless, human. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. We're still here. I spent the rest of my shift in the ER, throwing myself into the steady stream of patients that flowed through our doors. Broken bones, heart attacks, overdoses, the usual parade of human suffering that filled our nights. But every time there was a lull. Every time the department grew quiet, I could hear it. Screaming, faint but persistent, coming from somewhere above me, coming from OR7. Dr. Williams found me at 6 a.m., slumped over a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Marcus, you look like hell, what's wrong? I told him everything about the screaming, about Mrs. Patterson, about the surgical sponge I'd left inside her, about all the patients who haunted OR7 and maybe haunted me. He listened without judgment, the way good doctors do, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Marcus, he finally said, Mrs. Patterson isn't dead. I stared at him. What? Eleanor Patterson. I saw her last week in the clinic for her follow-up. She's fine. The surgery went perfectly. No complications, no infections, nothing. That's impossible. I saw her obituary, but when I showed him my phone, the obituary was gone. The browser history showed no record of my search. Instead, there was a news article about the upcoming renovation of OR7, dated 3 weeks in the future. Marcus, Dr. Williams said gently, when's the last time you slept? Really slept? I couldn't remember. The past few weeks had been a blur of double shifts and caffeine-fueled exhaustion. The renovation of OR7 had forced us to shuffle all surgeries to other rooms, creating a bottleneck that had us all working overtime. I started, then stopped. The memories felt slippery, unreliable. Had I really seen Mrs. Patterson's ghost? Had I really found blood on the floor of an empty room? You need to go home, Dr. Williams said. Get some real sleep. The hospital will survive without you for 1 day. I nodded, but I knew I wouldn't sleep, because even if it had all been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress, the guilt was real, the mistakes were real, and somewhere in the back of my mind I could still hear them screaming. I left the hospital that morning determined to never set foot in OR7 again, renovation or no renovation. But as I reached my car in the parking garage, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. It was a surgery schedule like the one I'd seen on the wall, but this one only had one entry: emergency surgery, Dr. Marcus Chen, patient self, scheduled for tonight. I crumpled up the note and threw it in the nearest trash can, but as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every mirror I passed seemed to reflect not just my face, but other faces behind it. Faces of patients I'd lost, patients I'd failed, patients who were still waiting for someone to remember them. That night, despite my exhaustion, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in OR 7, surrounded by the accusatory stares of the dead. At 2:47 a.m., the exact time I'd first heard the screaming, my phone rang. The caller ID showed St. Mary's Hospital, OR 7. I let it go to voicemail, but the phone immediately rang again. Same number, same impossible caller ID. On the third ring, I answered, "Dr. Chen." My own voice came through the speaker but distorted as if it was coming from a great distance. "We need you in OR 7. Emergency surgery. Patient is crashing." The line went dead. I sat in my bed staring at the phone, trying to convince myself it was another hallucination. But then I heard it, faint but unmistakable, coming through my bedroom window. Screaming. I got dressed and drove back to the hospital, knowing I was probably having some kind of breakdown but unable to stop myself. The parking garage was empty except for a few cars belonging to the skeleton night crew. I took the elevator to the 4th floor, my heart pounding as the numbers climbed. The corridor was empty, but I could see light coming from under the door of OR 7. Not the harsh fluorescent lighting I'd seen before, but a softer, warmer glow. I approached the door slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The caution tape was gone, the lock was open, and from inside I could hear voices, familiar voices discussing surgical procedures in calm, professional tones. I opened the door. The room was exactly as it had been 3 weeks ago, before the renovation. All the equipment in place, everything, clean and sterile and ready for surgery. But the surgical table wasn't empty this time. I was lying on it. Not a hallucination, not a ghost, but me, unconscious, intubated, with a surgical team working around my body. I recognized Dr. Williams at the head of the table, managing my airway. Nurse Rodriguez was monitoring vitals, and standing at my side, scalpel in hand, was Mrs. Patterson, but not the ghost version I'd seen before. This was Mrs. Patterson as she'd been in life, competent, caring, professional. She'd been a surgical nurse for 30 years before her retirement, and she was looking down at my unconscious form with the same expression of focused concentration I'd seen on countless surgeons over the years. "Ah, Dr. Chen," she said without looking up from her work. "I wondered when you'd arrive. We've been waiting for you." What is this?" I managed to ask. "Your surgery," she replied matter-of-factly, making a precise incision across my chest. "You've been carrying around so much guilt, so much pain that it's become a tumor, a malignant mass that's been growing inside you for years, poisoning everything around it." I watched in fascination and horror as she worked, her hands steady and sure despite the fact that she was supposed to be dead. Around the table, other figures materialized. All the patients I'd lost over the years, but not as the accusatory ghosts I'd imagined. They were as they'd been in life, professional and competent, working together to save me. "We're not angry with you," Mr. Rodriguez said as he adjusted the anesthesia. "We never were. Death is part of life, and you did everything you could for us." "Then why?" I started to ask, but Sarah Kim interrupted. "The screaming you heard," she said, "it wasn't us screaming in anger. It was you screaming in guilt. We've been trying to help you, to show you that you don't have to carry this burden alone." Mrs. Patterson's hands moved with practiced precision, and I felt something being lifted from my chest. Not physical pain, but emotional weight that I'd been carrying for so long. I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. "The mistakes you've made," she continued, "they don't define you. They teach you. They make you a better doctor, a better person, but only if you let them." As she worked, I felt the screaming inside my head, screaming I hadn't even realized was there, begin to fade. The faces around the table were peaceful, satisfied with their work. "We can't stay much longer," David Thompson said, monitoring my vitals on machines that somehow seemed both high-tech and ethereal. "This isn't our world anymore, but we wanted you to know that you're forgiven, Marcus. You always were." Mrs. Patterson completed the surgery with a final, careful stitch. "The healing has to come from you now," she said, finally looking up to meet my eyes. "But the infection is gone. The guilt has been removed. What you do with this second chance is up to you." The room began to fade around the edges, and I found myself back in the empty, renovated OR7, standing alone among the construction debris. But something had changed. The weight in my chest was gone. The voices in my head were silent. And for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. I walked out of the operating room and never looked back. 3 months later, OR7 reopened after its renovation. The asbestos had been removed, new equipment installed, fresh paint applied to every surface. It looked nothing like the room where I'd confronted my ghosts, and everything like a place where healing could happen. Was scheduled to assist with the first surgery in the renovated room, a routine appendectomy for a young man who'd come in through the ER. As I scrubbed in, I thought about Mrs. Patterson and the others, wondering if they'd found the peace in death that they'd helped me find in life. The surgery went perfectly. No complications, no mistakes, no lives lost. Just skilled professionals doing what they'd trained to do, helping someone who needed their expertise. As we closed up the patient, I noticed something that made me smile. On the wall where the old surgery schedule used to hang, someone had placed a small plaque, in memory of all those who trusted us with their lives. May their sacrifice make us better healers. I never heard screaming from OR7 again. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between patients, I swear I can hear something else, a gentle whisper of encouragement, a reminder that we're all human. We all make mistakes, and forgiveness is always possible, even forgiveness of ourselves. The hospital administration never did figure out who had placed that plaque on the wall. But I knew, and I knew that somewhere, Mrs. Patterson and the others were at peace, their final surgery complete. The surgery that had saved not a patient's life but a doctor's soul.